It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. We are live in the green space today. Andy Borowitz, the New Yorker humorist, coming up later this hour with news so fake it might be real. And in the meantime, you can watch us do the show in the green space, because when we're in the green space, we stream live video. You can go to WNYC.org or the WNYC Facebook page for that. And with us now in the green space, it's none other than our Trump Inc. team, WNYC's Andrea Bernstein and Ilya Marritz, and ProPublica's managing editor, Eric Umansky. They do the podcast on all the ways the Trump business world intersects with the public interest. Hello, Trump Inkers. Welcome back to the green space.
Hey, Brian.
Hey, Brian. Was your news so real you want it to be fake?
Good one.
I have to remember that. That's the New York Times. The Borowitz report is not. That's the rest of the New Yorker. All right. So, Ilya, let's start with a piece of today's breaking news. Last night, the Times put out a story with some Trump tax return details for a 10-year stretch, 1985 to 1994. As a connoisseur of Donald Trump's finances, what's the headline according to your read?
Well, it's so interesting because it's occurring with the backdrop of the House of Representatives trying to get Donald Trump's more recent tax returns. 1985 feels like a very long time ago. And yet, because what they got is a 10-year stretch of tax information, not tax returns, but tax information, they were able to really shine a light on what his business was at the time. I grew up in New York. I was very little at the time, but I did grow up in New York, so I remember sort of very faintly the acquisition of the Plaza Hotel and when Donald Trump was on the cover of all the magazines. And the headline, to answer your question, is Donald Trump reported over $1 billion in business losses over a decade, and that is more than maybe anybody else in the United States. It is a staggering sum of money, and if you are somebody who gets a paycheck every 2 weeks and gets a W-2, it's pretty hard to fathom how you can have those kind of business losses and still be a very rich man. But that is the situation. And
you tweeted that this, quote, brutally rewrites the narrative Trump crafted in 1987 with The Art of the Deal.
Yeah, I mean, the fascinating subtext to all of this is while Trump is accumulating all of these losses from many different businesses, I should say, from casinos, from getting involved in stock trading, in an airline, trying to get involved in like an alternative football league, and he's losing money everywhere. But while that's happening, he's also co-writing, having a ghostwritten book, The Art of the Deal, which cemented his relationship as the consummate deal maker. And I think what he discovered, Andrea and I were just talking about this, is faking it kind of is making it. And if you sell the public on a story about yourself, and you use the tax code, as he has admitted he uses the tax code, you can be a success.
Right. I mean, here we have these hundreds of millions of dollars of losses, as now revealed by the New York Times, in the very time period where his book, which was I'm going to tell you all how to be like me, was on the bestseller list for a year. That was 1987. So he was selling an image of himself very successfully that was completely divorced from reality. And I think sort of fast forwarding, the question that we should be asking ourselves is, how does that affect our current perception of what he says and what he does?
Eric?
There was another tidbit of it that really struck me. I mean, there were an enormous number of really fascinating details in it, apart from the big picture. And one of the things, and it was that word, 3,000 or some such, which was that Trump was also pushing, essentially hyping up hyping up stocks, saying he was going to do a takeover, stocks that he had purchased, so that basically he would pump up the price, and then he would sort of walk away with a profit. So, this goes back to what...
Is that even legal?
I don't know. But, this is, it's quintessential Trump, which is, he is, frankly, something of a savant at performative... at the kind of performance of it all, right? He makes a buck by telling you one thing, doing another, and selling people on an idea. By the way, P.S., he did it a couple of times, people ultimately got savvy to it and didn't respond to his carnival barking, and then he lost a ton of money. It was very much.
And then he
an
went
arc.
on to do completely different things, as
Right.
we've learned. So this period ends in the mid-1990s, and as we now know, among the things he did were foreign licensing deals and The Apprentice, big things that he did. So golf courses is now something that he's in. So his business, sort of what it is, keeps changing, which is one of the very confounding things for us. Is it's not like he's just a real estate developer or even a real estate developer or has even been a real estate developer for decades. It's that he's doing all of these things that are constantly evolving, and we're constantly asking ourselves, what is this?
Right.
So this record is a sense of like the business is the business. The business is making money however he can.
And that brings us to such an interesting question with the president, when potentially his recent tax returns could become public. Where would that perhaps reveal a gulf between what we know about him or what he says about himself and what he's reporting to the IRS? Wait and see.
Related is that the Treasury Secretary has said that the government will not release Trump's more current tax returns, as the Ways and Means Committee has requested that they do. But meanwhile, there's a bill working its way through the New York State legislature that would allow the release of Trump's state tax returns because, he files in New York. Eric, any take on this? If it passes, how would that change things?
So again, I should point out I'm not a tax lawyer, I think we would probably find out a bunch of details, but just keep in mind, the Mnuchin refusing to release the returns is happening in a larger context of the administration refusing to respond to Congress in all sorts of ways. We just got news this morning that they are going to refuse to turn over the full Mueller report. We know that they've ordered Don McGahn. McGahn, I'm sorry, the former White House counsel, not to testify, and the list goes on and on. So just because a state may push for something, it's not clear what's going to happen here.
Right. And I just also want to add about Steve Mnuchin. One of the things that's very startling is right after he went and said no one can see the president's tax returns, or shortly after, he went to the Trump International Hotel in Washington and undisclosed to the world, although the Washington Post found out about it, he appeared at a fundraiser for donors. So he's raising money for the president's campaign right after refusing to show the American public the president's tax returns in a hotel in a business that the president is actively profiting from at this moment. And that, in a nutshell, I think sort of shows why everyone should subscribe to Trump Inc., but it shows the fundamental problem and why there are so many conflicts, because the president has not divested. He's actively profiting from his business, which is why his tax returns are so relevant, if they weren't relevant for a million other reasons, which they are.
And it shows that Steve Mnuchin could be the Treasury Secretary and the campaign treasurer at the same time. It seems like another thread of this investigative legal combat on so many fronts that's taking place right now that Trump Inc. has reported on is Deutsche Bank records, Donald Trump's banking records with Deutsche Bank. Who wants to jump in on that and explain why Congress is subpoenaing those particular records, why Deutsche Bank was ready to comply with the subpoena, and why Trump is now, I guess, suing Deutsche Bank to get them to defy the subpoena?
Right. And he's also suing his own accountant to prevent them from releasing information, as well as refusing to give any information to Congress. I think we have an episode coming up later this month about Deutsche Bank. But let me just say in a nutshell that there are a series of really unexplained loans to the Trump organization. So this is a period, we're talking right in the years before he was president, where basically no traditional U.S. bank, not Citibank, not J.P. Morgan Chase, not HSBC, et cetera, these banks would not loan to Trump precisely because of some of the problems with his business, that he kept declaring these losses and then saying to the bank, well, I'm not paying for it, you pay for it, which is essentially what he did. He did that with banks, he did it with stockholders, he did it with business partners, he did it with vendors. So the Deutsche Bank comes in and they loan him a lot of money for several different developments, for the Doral golf course in Florida, for the bank, for the old post office development in Washington, D.C., and they were extremely high loan-to-value ratios. So the question is raised, why was Deutsche Bank loaning Trump money? And we don't really quite understand that. They say they were making money and it was profitable for them. But one of the big questions is why? Why were they willing to have a financial relationship? Why were they willing to give him these extremely generous loans with very few strings attached? The other thing that was going on during this period, not related to Trump, but Deutsche Bank was found by New York State financial regulators to have been involved in a multi-billion-dollar money laundering scheme from Moscow to New York. So in something that was called as mirror trades. Now that did not involve Trump or anything to do with Trump, but the New York regulators specifically cited Deutsche Bank for having a culture of sort of non-compliance across the globe. So that's a paraphrase, but that is essentially what they were saying. So is there a connection? We don't know, and so far as we can tell, that's what the New York State Attorney General and various congressional oversight committees are trying to have a window into.
We have to take a short break. We'll continue with our Trump Inc. team in a minute. Listeners, 212-433-WNYC. If you have a question, raise your hands here in the green space. If you have a question, we have a little bit more to cover, including the government's bar tab, that is your taxpayers' bar tab at Mar-a-Lago, the latest Trump Inc. scoop, and a little more. And then Andy Borowitz, the New Yorker humorist, will join us as we segue from news so real you wish it was fake to news so fake it feels like it's real. Stay with us, Brian Lehrer in the green space on WNYC. Brian Lehrer on WNYC, live in the green space today with our Trump Inc. team, WNYC's Andrea Bernstein and Ilya Marritz, and ProPublica's managing editor, Eric Umansky. They do the podcast on all the ways the Trump business world intersects with the public interest, Trump Inc. And let's see, who gets this one? Well, you can tell me who gets this one. You have a story on Trump Inc. about the Winter White House. The headline of this is The Government's Bar Tab at Mar-a-Lago. This one is not about William Barr, right?
No, it is
Oh,
about...
no, yeah, go ahead.
It's about the library bar at Mar-a-Lago, which is a bar in a library. It has a big portrait of Donald Trump in his tennis whites, a well-known kind of portrait. And what the story's really about, certainly the first part of the story, is really about how this one agency, the State Department, sort of woke up to a new reality when Donald Trump became president and started spending all this time at his Winter White House, at his private club, Mar-a-Lago. It's both a residence, it's a country club, and it's a place where he does foreign policy, where he has ordered missile strikes on Syria, a place where he's met foreign leaders. And so the State Department very early on was confronted with this question of how it handles expenses there. And we know that one night in April, a bunch of what were described as White House aides went to the library bar, asked the bartender to leave, and served themselves about $1,000 worth of alcohol. And
I can give a quick list of the alcohol.
Oh,
here.
please,
This is my value add. So we have 16 tequila Patron, 22 Chopin, I'm not sure to pronounce that, 10 Don Julio, Blanco, also tequila, and 6 Woodford Reserve.
Which is bourbon, I think, right?
Which is bourbon, and it all came in at $838. Plus, of course, the service fee for the bartender who was not there.
But they took off taxes, weirdly.
Yes, and they took off taxes. Thanks, God.
I was just at a restaurant the other night, and I happened to notice that the Woodruff Reserve was the most expensive bourbon on the menu, a little above Maker's Mark.
Is that right? So
why do we care about
so
this?
this bill arrives at the State Department a few weeks later, and the State Department says, we didn't know about this, we're not going to pay. Ultimately, the White House pays. But it kicks off this period where the State Department sort of had to figure out, well, how are we going to spend money at the president's private club? Not only because of who the president is and that he's the boss of the club as well as the boss of the country, but also they basically had to go around a number of federal contracting rules or comply with those rules to make this work. You're really not supposed to put an alcoholic tab, I think generally. You're not supposed to bill to the government. conference rooms. They wanted to bill more than would have been the government rate. And so ultimately what ends up happening is the State Department gets a special Citibank travel card purely for use at Mar-a-Lago. And it's one of these examples of something that we wouldn't know about unless a court had forced the Trump administration to comply with a Freedom of Information request from a group called Property of the People. We have them to thank for these paper records. But this, 2+ years in, this is the unresolved conflict of interest. Active business, active president,
And
same guy.
You could think about it as a kind of issue of, frankly, petty conflicts, right? It's $1,000. It's not going to bankrupt the U.S. Treasury. But there are some much deeper issues that are going on that are not just sort of conflicts as a general thing. One of the issues with Mar-a-Lago is it is, as a private but profit-making club, the president is incented to keep access to it, right? To bring people in, which is a thing. We reported that there are essentially these kind of tour groups that come in. Well, one of the challenges with access is that can run in tension with security, right? And we've seen these stories about a Chinese national who came in and seemed to have some monitoring equipment. The details of it, aren't quite clear. But you have this very obvious tension between the interest of the president's pocketbook, frankly, the interest of the government's own security.
Before we run out of time, I want to bring up one last loose thread. And Ilya, I think this is in your portfolio too, because you've been reporting on the Trump inauguration and some of the conflicts of interest that arose in the funding of that. Yesterday, a former inauguration staffer named Stephanie Wolkoff made news when she was interviewed or wrote a piece, I forget, for the New York Times and made some accusations. Can you put this in context?
Yeah, so Stephanie Winston Wolkoff, her company was the largest contractor for the Trump inauguration. So there's always been a lot of attention on her because the company took in $26 million, which is a ton of money. That said, I have felt, based on my reporting, that the focus on her is somewhat misplaced. And the fundamental question around the inauguration is the $107 million that was raised, which is about double as much as the next most expensive inauguration, and how it was spent. And we still have not had a full public accounting. But what we have learned, what we've been able to put on the record in our podcast, is that the Trump Organization was paid by his inauguration for use of the Trump International Hotel in D.C., and we've also been able to put on the record the fact that the inaugural chief, Tom Barrack, who's a private equity businessman and a friend of Donald Trump's, had his own plan to profit off of his connections in Trump's Washington. And I think that is where that's where my focus will remain. In addition, there are several investigations by different prosecutors who are looking into possible vectors of foreign donors trying to get their money in, and then perhaps get access to the new administration.
So, Andrea, for a last question, put on your political analyst hat, if you would, and look at the moment that we're in, this post-Mueller report moment of a kind of investigative legal combat on every conceivable front. As you were mentioning before, tax returns, no, we won't. Unredacted Mueller report, no, we won't. Deutsche Bank records, no, we won't. Don McGahn testimony, no, we won't. Maybe we will even see it, we don't know yet, over Mueller's own prospective testimony. Gerald Nadler, the Judiciary Committee chairman, called it a constitutional crisis this morning. Maybe that's hyperbole or maybe not. How do you see this moment? And politically, do you think the Democrats have to decide if they're doing the work of justice by going down all these rabbit holes into courtrooms, or if they're just political dead-enders, going to be seen that way going to 2020?
So I think that, a couple of things. So on the issue of the president's early business, which we were just talking about. This has been standard practice of Trump forever, which is not disclose. We found it when we started in Trump Inc. to try to look into his business. The answer is always no. No, you cannot have. No, you cannot see. No, you can't have this record, many of which have been previously public, and it goes to his presidency and his administration. So after the election, we had an episode of our podcast where we talked about what are all of these new Democrats in House chair positions of committees going to mean. And I think what we're seeing now is it has come to a head that the Trump organization and the White House are behaving the way they normally do, and the Democrats in Congress are trying to exercise their oversight, and that is inevitably going to come into conflict unless Trump all of a sudden says, no, I'm actually going to give you everything, which he has never done yet. Now, as to the political consequences, I mean, I think the Democrats have already decided we're asking for those records. They've not launched impeachment hearings. They've not started more aggressive maneuvers in that way. But just by trying to do their oversight role, they've been thwarted.
With Mitch McConnell going out publicly yesterday and saying, case closed.
And what they've said is, well, we can't just let this go because the Constitution is at stake. So it's not even real, it's beyond a political question from their standpoint at this moment.
Eric, 30 seconds.
Yeah, I do think that there is a fundamental test that we are going to be facing and are already facing, which is that Trump doesn't play by the rules. Right? Many of these things are not written into the law. We're now going to be tested. What real leverage is there? Right? What pressure is there going to be? What is he have to going to do? And I think the answers to that are very, very unclear.
And there's even more crossing the wire this hour, which we will continue to try to clarify through the day about Trump invoking executive privilege on some of that stuff. I think that's with respect to the unredacted Mueller report, perhaps, or conversations with Don McGahn. So this is continuing to rise as a story and a political challenge as well as a constitutional challenge. For now, we thank the members of our Trump Inc. team, Ilya Marritz, Andrea Bernstein, and Eric Umansky, the managing editor of ProPublica. Please thank our guests.
Thank you.
Thank you. For news so real you wish it was fake, Andrea's new slogan.
And don't forget to subscribe to Trump Inc.
Andy Borowitz next. Stay with us.